Lesson 118 is about completing the square. Now, completing the square is a method that we use in order to solve quadratic equations. And the quadratic equations that we'll use to complete the square might look something like this. We might have 3x squared plus 7x plus 9 is equal to 0. And we want to figure out what x is equal to in order to make the left side equal to the right side. There would be two values because the degree of the function is 2. Now to complete the square we need to follow these steps. Step 1. Set up the equation in the form of ax squared plus bx equals the constant. So with the blue that I've written up there we could say it would be 3x squared plus 7x is equal to negative 9. We move the constant to the right hand side of the equation. Step 2. Set up the equation in the form of ax squared plus bx plus a c value equals the constant plus the c value. What that would look like is this. 3x squared plus 7x plus our constant c, or a c value, is equal to our constant, negative 9, plus our c value. Step 3 is to solve for c. c here on both sides of our equation equals b over 2 squared. Step 4 is to factor the trinomial that happens on the left-hand side in the form of x plus b over 2 squared. And then step 5 is to solve for x. We're going to go through steps 3, 4, and 5 in our next few problems. Please pause the video now to copy down these 5 steps for completing the square. Okay, let's go ahead and begin our first problem. We want to complete the square to solve. We have x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. Now, we don't necessarily need to complete the square to solve this. We could take this trinomial and break it into two binomials, and we could factor to solve. Let's do that just to see what our answer is. We know x times x is x squared. 3 times 2 is 6, and 3 plus 2 is 5, so x plus 3 and x plus 2. So our answers will be x equals negative 3 and x equals negative 2. We've got our answers. Now, when we factor when we complete the square to solve, we should get these same answers. Let's see what happens. So we're going to take x squared plus 5x, and we're going to make it equal to negative 6. Step 1, move the constant to the right. Step 2, x squared plus 5x plus our c value is going to equal negative 6 plus our c value. Now step 3 is to find what c is. And we know c is equal to b over 2 squared. So our b value is 5, so c is going to equal 5 over 2 squared, which equals 5 over 2 times 5 over 2. 5 over 2 times 5 over 2, that must equal 25 over 4. Now our next step is to input that here. X squared plus 5x plus 25 fourths, because that's our c value, we need to input it, is equal to negative 6 plus 25 fourths. The next step that we had was to factor the trinomial. And this is a nice pattern, because when we factor the trinomial, we're always going to get x plus b over 2, 5 over 2, squared, and that's going to equal whatever is on the right-hand side. So we've got negative 6 plus 25 fourths. Well, I'd rather not write it like that, because we're adding fractions. So instead of writing negative 6, I'm going to write negative 24 fourths, because that's the same as negative 6. So when we solve this, we're going to get x plus 5 over 2 squared is going to be equal to 1/4. And now we can find our answer by solving for x. In order to undo something that's squared, we have to take the square root. So we're going to get, well, if we take the square root of both sides, and it would look like this. Square root undoes the square. Take the square root here, and we're going to get x plus 5/2 is equal to, well, the square root of 1/4. The square root of 1 equals 1, and the square root of 4 is equal to 2. So x plus 5/2 equals 1/2, but it has to be plus 1/2 or negative 1/2, because we're talking about a square root. Our final step will be to subtract 5/2 from both sides. So when we look at that final step, x is going to equal negative 5/2 plus or minus 1/2. Now, let's go ahead and go through the math. X equals negative 5/2 plus 1/2. That's going to equal negative 4/2, which is equal to negative 2, just like we saw before. Negative 5/2 minus 1/2, x is going to equal negative 6/2, which equals negative 3. We've got our same answer that we did before. We could go ahead and box these two. Extra little line in there. We've got our right answer. Now, you might be wondering why we go through all this work with completing the square in order to do something that we could do in just 2 steps with factoring. And the answer is because we can't always factor everything to solve. So we've got to have an alternative method, and completing the square is that method. Let's look at another one. Alright, we're going to complete the square to solve. This one, if we set it up in our other format, and let's look at why we need to complete the square first. X squared plus 5x plus 3 equals 0. The reason we need to complete the square is there's nothing that can multiply to 3 and add to 5. So we've got to have another method. Completing the square is another method that we can use. So here we go. X squared plus 5x is equal to negative 3. We move our constant to the other side. Then we have to put in our c value. X squared plus 5x plus c is equal to negative 3 plus c. I'd like to underline the c so that we know that we need to fill that in. Now, c is equal to b over 2 squared. Same b as last time. So we're going to get 5 over 2 squared, which we know equals 25/4. b is not always 5, but in our 2 examples it was. So here we go. X squared plus 5x plus 25/4 is equal to negative 3 plus 25/4. And now, for this one, instead of rewriting the negative 3 here, I'm going to write that as a fraction. That's going to be negative 12/4, because that's the same as negative 3. Now we can factor our trinomial into a binomial. That's going to be x plus b over 2, 5 over 2, squared. And it'll always be that same pattern. You take your b value and half it to get what goes here. That's going to equal 13/4. Then we need to take the square root of both sides. So x plus 5/2 is going to equal plus or minus the square root of 13/4. Okay, we're going to work backwards now a little bit. We're running out of room down there. Square root of 13/4, that's the same as plus or minus the square root of 13 all over the square root of 4, which is 2. X is going to equal, when we subtract 5/2 to move it to the right-hand side, negative 5/2 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 2. We've got our final answer. We don't want to simplify this anymore because we've got a radical that's not a perfect square. And we want to leave it like that so we don't lose any precision by making it a decimal. This one has 2 answers. We know it should because our degree is 2. Got negative 5/2 plus the square root of 13 over 2 and negative 5/2 minus the square root of 13 over 2. This is the reason that we need to be able to complete the square, is to find answers for quadratic equations that we're not able to factor. We'll practice completing the square more during our lesson practice, page 499. Make sure you've got your notes complete, and I'll see you during our next class.